Going live.
Okay, and we're back with episode 8 of The Wire,
That's
season 1.
season one. And what's this one called?
Good question.
I have a new name for it.
We've got the epigraph.
I got a new name for it. Do you know what it is?
What?
Rat. I am all about the rat. This one's called Lessons.
Lessons.
And it's interesting because there's a few lessons in this one. This one is a very educational one. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this one is all about education. So it's an interesting episode, and we can talk about a couple of those now if you want.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think one of the things that's interesting early on is we start to see Wallace. And Wallace is he's beat up by the stuff he's doing. And what happened with getting Brandon killed has haunted him, right? And so we see him, not in the very beginning, we'll talk about the very beginning in a bit, which is great with McNulty and his two kids, following Stringer Bell, which is so crazy. But we'll come back to that. You have Wallace in his rundown, abandoned walk-up row house, teaching one of his kids, I guess we could call them, or one of the, school-age kids, math. And there's that scene, where he's reading the math problem, and it's a kind of run-of-the-mill math problem, like if two people go and do this, and 5 people get off the bus, and 3 people get on the bus, what's going to happen? And I'm going to get the shot because I like it. And you have this is actually the shot of the girl who's asking him the question, and that's her, and they're going back and forth. And what happens is he reinterprets, just kind of like D'Angelo reinterpreted the chess game to explain chess to Poot and to Bodhi. He does the same thing, or it might have been Wallace and Bodhi. He does the same thing to explain the math problem, and he uses drug terminology. And at the end of it, and he goes through this whole thing like Bodhi's got X and Poot's got this, and you give it to D, and he's like, how come you can get that right? Because the kid gets it right, keeps track of everything, no problem, and you can't get this simple math problem. He's like, because they'll bust your ass, basically, because they'll kill you if you get the count wrong.
Yeah.
I think it's a great lesson, quote unquote.
Yeah, because what Wallace explained to her was like a real-world problem that made sense, whereas the word problem was, there's an abstraction there that she just didn't understand.
Yeah, and relevant to a world in which she didn't live.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's always that thing about the kind of, the context for these problems and who they appeal to and who they speak to. And you see the world in which she's living and who she's going to for help and his context. It's both an interesting and very powerful scene, but it's also about this lesson. And there's a few more. I mean, education plays a role here. We see Stringer Bell later on, and you're gonna frame this. Stringer Bell's at community college learning about macroeconomics and elastic prices and supply and demand, which is just awesome.
Yeah.
And then I'm sorry, go ahead.
Scene at the beginning, he has his kids play he calls it the spy game, where they're tracking Stringer Bell through the market. He just happened to spot him, send his kids after him because, they'll pick him out as a cop.
Yeah.
So they get his license number and finds the car and follows him to community college.
That's right.
But he's sitting in on a lesson, but then he brings that lesson back, and I love that scene. He's got a print shop, which is a front for whatever, but he's also trying to run it as a real business, and he's got his, corner boys working in there with him, and they're just like,
Yeah.
They treat the customers like they treat the dope fiends in the projects.
That's right. There was a whole thing, right? We've already talked about between Dee and Bodhi.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Stringer's saying, no, you can't do that. This is a business. They can go elsewhere. You got to treat them right. We've got to run this right.
Yeah.
None of that corner stuff. No front. It's all business.
That's right.
And I love that little part because that's where Stringer's coming from. He wants to get out of that.
Yeah.
And just stick with the making money part.
And that's been told to us several times, not only through, Stringer Bell's character and his glasses and very much playing the accountant, but also, like you said, he's the only one not wearing orange, or he's just different amongst the gangsters. Unlike Avon, he's not go to the mattresses, get out your guns and start firing. Like, he's trying to find a way to legitimize it, right? Legitimize his approach.
Yeah.
It's interesting. The other lesson, so you have the lesson of Stringer Bell at macroeconomics, but you also have the lesson of Carver and Herc taking the police test. And there's that point where they're studying together, and Carver asks a serious question, and Herc goes into this long, stupid answer about what he would do if X, Y, and Z happened. And it's interesting. The episode, just on the surface, really does come together around terms of lessons and teaching, and Jimmy teaching his kids, like you said, how to follow Stringer Bell. And all of that pulls this episode together in some interesting ways. There's on top of that, but I love this idea of the lesson, and I think it's something that The Wire does all the time with giving us lessons and teaching us, if not how to read it, but, how to think about the world in which we're trying to watch and understand, right? It's not just exploitative, here's this crazy, gun and crook world. Let's get into the actual vision of trying to understand what's at work here, particularly in this episode, the economics, right? The economics of it all. And that's when we finally see the driver, the limo driver for Clay Davis, come back, not as a limo driver, but as basically a cash man, a bag man, who's taking $20,000 in cash, drug money, to Clay Davis. And there's a whole kind of dissertation about what that means in this show.
Yeah. I guess there's a lesson there too.
Exactly.
Daniels talks about it too. It's something everyone knows, but no one talks about. And I kind of like that because I think it shows up. I don't know if it showed up already or it's going to show up again, but Lester Freeman gives that same story to people in the squad room. You follow the drugs. You get drugs, you follow the money. You don't know.
Where the hell are you going to end up? He said something like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true, and that's like you said. You talked about it in your post. Daniels is having that moment with Marla, and that moment is really about the recognition that he crossed the line. Burrell called him out, basically said, what are you, stupid? You're taking $20,000 of cash from a senatorial aide, and you want me to lose what? Everything, my clout, my politics. Like, we see Burrell's in it for the game. When they met in the previous episode, they were at a hoity-toity party where Clay Davis was there, and no, that's where he met the driver in the previous episode. And Daniels is also kind of in that game. So there was a little lesson there, too, about him being torn between being a cop and doing the police work he needs to do and not in order to move ahead. And it seems to be the choice,
Yeah. I guess there's a bit of foreshadowing in the previous episode because Burrell goes to talk to Clay Davis, Daniels ends up talking to Day Day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's actually a very nice parallel for what's going to happen and come back full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's definitely a ton of lessons in there, and there's also some great visuals. You queued up a few. And I have some too. I liked it. I'm learning from you, Paul. So I'll give you a couple, and it's going to overlap with the framing that you talk about. But I want to look at two quickly. I want to look at some of the things you've been talking about again and again in these episodes, and like I said, I've taken it as a lesson. I'm trying to figure it out for myself. I love this one where Stringer Bell is in class, right? And you already have that one. You've brought that one up. So this is Stringer Bell in class, and I'll share this now. And what I found fascinating about it is the next cut, the next scene. So here we'll see in the framing. Let me get it. Sorry, taking me a second. But we see Stringer Bell here in class, right? So we have him, and you'll talk a little bit about the framing, which I think is right, but I'll let you do that. But the next shot, interestingly enough, is another classroom, right? But it's not a classroom in a community college. It's a classroom where Herc and Carver are taking their test, right? So it's actually the classroom where Herc makes that joke about Carver and et cetera, et cetera. So let's see if I can find that one. So this is the other shot, standing right next to it. And I thought this is interesting. Like, so that's the very next shot, right? Yeah. And it's putting Stringer and the cops in the same space, right? Usually that's a very opposed space, but in this episode it's not, right? They're all going to school. They're all learning how the game is played. And
they're all trying to move up in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lesson, quote unquote, there, right? But it's interesting. So I'm picking up on that visual language that you keep talking about, and it's everywhere. It's omnipresent.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those two shots of Bunk.
Yeah, sartorial Bunk, as you say, which I really like.
Yeah, well, you know,
not many detectives could get away with that shirt.
Yeah, yeah. So here he is in his pink shirt. Yeah, and you know, McNulty makes a point of talking about that. You know, how many people could get away with that?
That's right.
And yeah, that is beautiful.
And that captures his character so well, and he's such a great character.
But then we get this shot of him later, and let's see if I can switch my shots. And this is like he's totally intoxicated in the apartment of, you know, a woman he went home from the bar in, and you know, that's not his shirt anymore. That's her bathrobe. You know, he's still got his tie on, which is impressive, and he's there in his underwear.
Yeah, having some real fun with that.
Yeah, and he's he tried to burn his clothes because the trace evidence, you know, being with another woman he can't bring home to his wife.
Right. Well, I also love the shot you shared on your blog of Bunk reading.
Oh, yeah.
Bunk reading the book. And you did the research on who wrote the book and what the book was about, and I'll let you speak to that. But what I really loved about that shot is, you know, look at Bunk, right? He is sartorial. Yeah. He's got the glasses down. He's reading, right? You know, he's got the little jewelry there. Like, you know, the Bunk's a presence.
Yeah, he's all dressed up, and he's all studious. And I saw that Laura Lipman, and, you know, it's just like a passing scene. Like, they show him reading this, and he puts it away, and then the scene starts, basically. But I was thinking, there's got to be something behind that, you know, that they're putting that name in front of us. So I looked it up, and it's a Baltimore author. Writes mystery stories, detective stories that are set in Baltimore. And she used to work for the Sun before she became an author, the Baltimore Sun, the newspaper. You know, and that like ties into a lot of what's going on in the series. It's going to move into the papers. You know, when I was reading the Wikipedia entry about Laura Lipman, I found, oh yeah, she's married to David Simon. You know,
it's a full-blown Easter egg.
Yeah.
Right? It's a wire Easter egg, and I bet you there's many more. But that's definitely one, right? Like, they planted it.
Yeah.
And look, all the pieces matter, Paul.
Yeah.
It's awesome. I love that. Yeah. I thought that was a great find. You're a true detective. You're natural police.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Other shot I like. This is just like for the composition sense. Scene of them having a discussion, but it's got that symmetrical composition. You've got that dividing line in the middle.
Yeah.
The same, setup behind them, and they've got sort of matching poses.
Yeah.
And that can be like really visually striking, and they've got like the subtle differences that just make it not forced.
Yeah. Exactly.
Still a really strong image.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I appreciate this, and in one of the things I think Mike Neary was saying on talking about his watching The Wire 10 years later or whatever, and he was saying one of the things that struck him, or he was saying that it was striking to watch it 10 years later, but he didn't really go into detail as to what was different. And for me, watching it this time, not 10 years later, but I'd say about 5 or 6 years later, what's striking is all of the visual. It's the trail we're taking through the visual language, because, like I said, the textual hits you right away, and it's sinking, and it's deep, and it's not, the scripting and dialogue is awesome. But all the other stuff you could miss, and so it's nice to kind of sink in a little.
Yeah.
Some of the other elements here that I think are really just great.
Yeah. Yeah. Because some of the people, in class are going to be seeing this for the first time, and they're going to get the story, because that's your main focus. But we're looking at it for the second or third or whatever time. We can pick up on those little details because we know the story. Now we can look at all the little pieces of how it's getting told. Mm.
Well, one of the things that struck me, and I'll go back to that, and this is kind of, it's again the design and the relationship and the kind of playing between the two gangs, right? The police gang and the drug gang. And one of the ones that struck me, and I'll share this real quick, is Jimmy McNulty when he's following Stringer, and we talked about that, and we see Jimmy McNulty here checking his pager, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting kind of flip of what we usually see. That's usually D'Angelo or Bird or Stinkum or whoever would be doing that. And then in the next shot, he's doing that. In the very next shot, we have Jimmy actually going to a payphone, right? And it's a Verizon payphone, all the ones we always see in the kind of in the pit or wherever or in the towers. And he's on the Verizon payphone hearing from Daniels, right? And to me, it's a really interesting, and being able to focus on not so much what he's calling Daniels for, is because Daniels is like, why the hell is the judge calling us saying, Burrell's up my ass and what's going on here? I could actually focus on the play they're doing here visually. We're putting Jimmy in the regular or the kind of the familiar situation of where we see D'Angelo and everyone else reporting up to the bosses to tell them what happened, to explain themselves, and to be doing the job. So I was kind of struck by that. I was kind of like, oh, wow, check that out. Like, again, that motif finding its way in with kind of trying to blur the distinction between these two groups.
Yeah, they're on different sides but operating on the same level in a way, yeah.
Truly.
And part of that same scene is one that I brought up in the blog. You've got that frame within a frame thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And, that happens again with Stringer in the classroom. It's sort of framed by the window. Jimmy's framed by the mirror, and that's that reflection thing again that's going on. And the other one you've got sort of frame within a frame within a frame, because you can see Jimmy in the rearview mirror, and then in the frame of the windshield, we're looking out on the street at Stringer's car. And that's just like a really interesting way of putting pictures together and like telling the story, two things going on in one picture there.
Yeah, and the frame within a frame, we've seen that a lot in Mario Bava's, particularly Danger Diabolique. He did a beautiful job of talking about how he was framing each of these shots within a frame and that's a particular movie. It's actually what's called a fumetti, or a comic that was turned into a movie, and it's framing these particular situations. And so whenever I see a frame within a frame now, I always think about the comic element of it, or the way in which film, like comics, tries to break up time and action in different ways to give a sense of being, in a space or within a frame, like the frame of the film, is controlling how we understand and view the world. But what I also liked, and you brought in that post, is the idea of being watched. The frame is always a frame of surveillance. Every camera has a frame, every kind of, you see this, a frame for your windshield, a frame for the door where you're looking in on Stringer. So the idea of the frame reinforcing, again, this, huge, constant theme throughout season 1 of surveillance and being surveyed within the frame is interesting. And it's usually you're in another thing we haven't really thought about, but we might, is whose perspective are you taking on at any given time? Like, we're kind of on the back of Jimmy. We're kind of on his shoulder watching Stringer, right? Mm-hmm. And there's that notion of not only the frame, but whose perspective and who's viewing what. And there's some weird moments where you have perspectives like you're looking down on the pit, and then you shoot up, and there's that great scene where you shoot up and you see Baltimore and those big buildings. And the question I'm always thinking about is whose perspective is that? Like those establishing shots that we talked about yesterday with those big buildings, and then it goes in, and sure, it's establishing a move in the episode, but oftentimes we have shots that are framed from a perspective, like the one with Jimmy watching Stringer, and it would be interesting to see how often, if you watch closely, that perspective shifts between, say, the drug dealers and the cops. And do we get the drug dealer's perspective as much as we do get the cops, and et cetera? And are they aware of that? Like, just starting to think now about camera angles and about the assumption the camera makes about who we're watching and how.
Yeah, because some of the shots, we're looking up at the police building, and that sort of puts us on the street. And there's another one that showed up. There's lots of pictures of architecture in there, and I just sort of like the looks of them. It's sort of like a head-on shot of some of the buildings. So I'm assuming from here we're inside the police building looking out the window?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, there's another one, too, and I'm going to show this one. This is another perspective shot, which kind of is one of the things that made me think about it. It's a perspective shot where Omar is going after Stinkum and Wee-Bey, and actually gets Stinkum, so this is after he shot Stinkum. But he's now going to try and get Wee-Bey. And so Wee-Bey gets shot in the leg. He's just been shot, and let's watch the clip and see if so he's there at the car, takes some shots, and you don't see who he's looking at. That's kind of like his visual, right? Yeah. And there he is, look, and you see that little rat running by, which I love. They caught the rat, and you can tell they were surprised when they caught the rat because the camera actually almost follows the rat. It's like, oh, wait, there's a rat, check it out. But you're down on the ground in Wee-Bey's perspective looking for where the hell is Omar. And that heightens the real action of that scene. And I just love that not only on the ground you see this body, which is Stinkum's up ahead, but then you see this rat scramble across the street, ostensibly running away from Omar. So it's a really just that perspective, and that scene in particular, I just love that scene. I think it's one of the best done scenes in the first season. Very memorable.
Yeah, and that whistling comes in, and we heard it before, but it's so much more haunting here because it feels disembodied. It's in the dark. You can't really see where it's coming from.
Yeah.
There's like a slight echo on it, it sounds.
And it's really effectively done in terms of the shooting of that scene. That you're like Wee-Bey. You're kind of disorientated. You're shocked. You're confused. You don't know where the hell he is. You can't put your head up because if you do, it's potential that I get shot off. So it's a really claustrophobic kind of contained moment where perspective shot makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense to take this perspective of Wee-Bey on the ground, not able to see the actual scene that he's having to negotiate. And it's a powerful scene for a lot of reasons, but also the empty streets. The fact that we're kind of in the Old West, right? And Omar really does kind of invoke the Old West. And rather than having a saloon and all these kind of, burnt out Western spaces, we just have a series of row houses that are burnt out. And it really does reimagine the inner city as the West.
Yeah. And that scene is where the epigraph comes in. You
That's
come
right.
at the king, you best not miss.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I find that interesting because we talk about the king, which brings back that chess metaphor.
King stays the
And they sort of talk about the king as Avon.
Yeah.
And Omar is like, I don't know. I mean, he's top of his game, I guess, but he's outside of.
But was he also? I mean, it's interesting because he says that, and what's interesting is he misses.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh.
So he actually misses. So you come at the king, you best not miss, and you wonder if if that's advice that for whatever reason he can't see through on his own, because it also foreshadows what's to come in another episode. So it's interesting. I think maybe there, or might this be his kind of hubris?
Yeah, like he thinks he's the king, but maybe not so much.
And it's funny because he's sitting there earlier in this episode watching them burn his van. He had a clean angle on them. He obviously knew exactly what was going on. There was no surprise. So his kind of strategy and his notion of code go back to the previous episodes. Omar has a very kind of particular code. And I don't know. I hadn't thought about the whole king-pawn thing until you kind of put that out. But is Omar putting himself in a king, or is he admonishing himself not to miss?
Yeah, maybe both. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Or maybe after he misses,
Yeah.
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 What else? Have we talked long enough?
Probably. Did we get everything? Yeah, that's pretty much of it.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in this episode, but one of the things that I'm starting to think about is those transitions you've been talking about, visual, the idea of the kind of the Easter egg that are everywhere. I mean, I was starting to think in Judge Fallon's office, there's a movie poster. So I want to go back and see what exactly is that movie. And it's one of the beautiful things about having these stuff in videos. You can go back and start playing detective. And, it's almost like Presbalewski, right? It's fun to sit around and figure this stuff out, potentially, world enough in time. But it is that idea of being a detective of an opus, right?
Yeah. Looking at all the pieces, how they fit together, and what they're accomplishing. Because it all goes into the storytelling.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting, right, like that, part of watching so closely and reading so closely and trying to kind of dissect the anatomy of these episodes and of the larger series is starting to get at some of the elements that make compelling stories, right? Like, we watch stories and tell stories and listen to stories all the time. Like, what makes them compelling? Like, what scenes are compelling about a particular episode and why? And it would be interesting to kind of do these breakdowns scene by scene. And I think that's the habit you've gone into of saying, like, that's compelling to me, and taking it out of context and looking at why and kind of slowing it down, like removing pieces from the story helps you kind of think about it. And what's interesting about digital is the digital storytelling in this guy is all about that. It's all about dislocating pieces of story across different media, or even being able to break it down in ways that possibly we couldn't in an analog world. So the ability to not only break down the story, but to look at two stories of completely different resources and imagine how they can be put back together to tell a new one is kind of a phenomenon of the digital age to some degree, not entirely, but it's interesting.
Yeah, and yeah, about how the different elements tell a story and what they're doing. Because we go back to those two pictures of Bunk in pink.
Yeah.
He, it could have been a plain, white bathrobe and one of his regular blue shirts, and it would have had so much less of an effect there, you
Yeah.
know.
Exactly.
Um, but it's like not even really played up in the second scene. I mean, McNulty points out the pink shirt as
Yeah.
if you wouldn't notice that anyway. Um, but then it's not mentioned at the end, but it's there, and it's
Yeah.
there's that visual harmony going through with that repetition.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not. I mean, and the epigraphs focus on the text and the dialogue, and it's not necessarily a bad thing to focus on the text and the way they talk, and that's something that. But I think oftentimes we just don't either recognize or don't pay attention or don't for a second stop and think about the visual rhetoric happening simultaneously. That in some ways is just as powerful, and not as obvious. And that kind of looking for the things that aren't obvious, I guess, is one of the privileges of going through this a few times. But it would also be very kind of useful while I was going through it to actually, be encouraged to look a little closer, right? To listen a little closer, to don't just focus on keeping up with the story, which is complex in and of itself. Right? So, yeah.
All
All
right.
right, Paul. Until tomorrow.
Until next time.
Yep, and I'm going to post these up on the site. I haven't yet, but I will.
All right, cool. All right.
All right.
See ya next time around.